What he unearths beneath his struggling farm isn't just a mysterious metal door, it's a gateway to a revolutionary technology that was deliberately hidden for generations. And when Rob Jenkins finally manages to break through this long-forgotten entrance, what he discovers inside doesn't just save his family's legacy, it transforms our understanding of sustainable agriculture forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning frost still clung to the dormant cornfields as Rob Jenkins climbed into the cab of his aging John Deere tractor. The weathered machine protested with a series of mechanical groans before reluctantly roaring to life, black smoke puffing from its exhaust stack against the pale Nebraska sky. Rob winced at the sound, another reminder of repairs he couldn't afford. The dashboard clock read 6:42 a.m., and the late October chill had already numbed his fingers despite the worn leather gloves he'd inherited from his father. At 45, Rob's face carried the weathered lines of a man who'd spent most of his life working outdoors. 26 years of farming the same land had taught him every inch of the Jenkins family farm, or at least he'd thought so until today. The bank's final notice lay folded in his jacket pocket, the paper worn thin from being repeatedly taken out, read and put away over the past week. 3 months until foreclosure. 3 months to somehow conjure up enough money to save 4 generations of his family's legacy. The field he was plowing today was the eastern plot, a stubborn stretch of land that had historically yielded less than the others. In a desperate attempt to prepare for spring planting, Rob had decided to try deep tilling this section, hoping to break through whatever mysterious subsurface issue had plagued it for years. His grandfather had always avoided planting here when possible, calling it the troubled acre, but Rob could no longer afford to leave any ground unworked. The tractor moved steadily across the land, the massive plow turning over the soil in neat furrows behind it. Rob's mind wandered as he drove, calculating and recalculating numbers that never added up to salvation. The past 5 years had been a slow-motion disaster, drought seasons followed by flooding, fluctuating corn prices, and equipment breakdowns that drained what little savings remained. Even Jack's college fund had been reluctantly tapped last year. The memory of his son's understanding smile when Rob had explained the situation only deepened the ache in his chest. The sharp metallic clang that suddenly rang through the tractor cab jolted Rob from his thoughts. The entire machine shuddered violently, nearly throwing him from his seat. Something in the field had struck the plow with enough force to rattle the family photo tucked into his dashboard, a snapshot of happier times with his late wife Emma, Jack, and himself standing proudly before a bumper harvest. Rob immediately killed the engine, the sudden silence almost as startling as the impact had been. "What in God's name?" he muttered, climbing down from the cab. The late autumn air bit at his face as he made his way to where the plow had struck the mysterious object. After farming the same land for more than 2 decades, Rob knew every sound his equipment could make. The dull thud of hitting a buried rock, the sharp crack of striking an old fence post, even the hollow echo of grazing a drainage pipe. But this sound had been different. It had resonated like striking an enormous bell, metallic, almost musical, and far too deliberate to be natural. Kneeling in the cold soil, Rob began clearing away dirt with his gloved hands. His fingers soon met something smooth and cold, too smooth and too perfectly curved to be a rock. Clearing more soil revealed what appeared to be a brushed metal surface. Its material, unlike anything he'd ever seen in farming equipment. It had a strange sheen to it, almost iridescent despite being buried for what must have been years. As Rob expanded his search area, the metal surface continued in both directions. This was no lost piece of equipment or abandoned machinery. Standing up to gain perspective, he could now make out a subtle depression in his field, a barely noticeable circular dip about 15 feet in diameter that he'd driven over countless times without giving it a second thought. But now, with part of its secret exposed, he could see how the ground gently sloped in a perfect circle. "How did I never notice this before?" Rob whispered to himself. Taking a shovel from his tractor, Rob began to dig more methodically around the metal surface. After 30 minutes of careful excavation, he had uncovered what appeared to be the edge of a massive circular plate, like a giant hatch or door embedded in his field. Around its circumference ran a series of intricate engravings, not quite letters, but definitely man-made. They reminded him vaguely of circuitry diagrams, but more elaborate, more intentional. His discovery filled him with equal parts excitement and unease. The Jenkins family had owned this land since 1897, when his great-grandfather William had first settled here after moving west from Pennsylvania. They'd worked every inch of these fields for generations. How had something this substantial remained hidden for so long? And more importantly, why was it here? Taking out his phone, Rob tried to photograph the strange engravings, but the morning light cast awkward shadows that made them difficult to capture clearly. He'd need better equipment and more time to properly document whatever this was. Yet something made him hesitate before calling anyone. This was his land, his discovery. After years of mounting failures and disappointments, this mystery felt like something that belonged to him alone, at least for now. Rob checked his watch. He should continue with his day's work. The autumn planting waited for no one, and he had acres left to prepare. But the pull of this discovery was too strong to ignore. 26 years of the same routine, the same struggles, and now this mystery had literally emerged from the ground beneath his feet. Looking back at his tractor, Rob made a decision. The field could wait. First, he needed to understand what he'd found. Little did Rob know that his choice to investigate further would set in motion a chain of events that would not only change his life forever, but would also unearth a century-old secret that had been deliberately buried beneath his family's farm, a secret that powerful people had been searching for and would do anything to control. The Jenkins family farm had once been the pride of Oakdale Valley, Nebraska. Standing at the edge of his partially plowed field, Rob could still picture how it looked in his childhood. Rows of gleaming equipment, busy farmhands, and silos filled to capacity with golden corn. His father, George Jenkins, had been respected throughout the county, not just for his impressive yields, but for his innovative irrigation techniques that consistently produced results even in drier years. But those days of prosperity had long since passed. At 45, Rob found himself struggling to keep even half of the farm's acreage productive. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The equipment shed told the story more eloquently than words could. Machines well past their prime kept running through makeshift repairs, baling wire, and sheer determination. The morning's discovery had interrupted his desperate attempt to prepare the eastern field, land he couldn't even afford to plant, without taking on more debt. As Rob walked back to his farmhouse, his mind turned to his great-grandfather's journal, a worn, leather-bound book passed down through generations, along with the farm itself. William Jenkins had been meticulous in his record-keeping, noting everything from weather patterns to crop rotations. But scattered throughout the journal were also cryptic references to what William called the sealed promise and the inheritance beneath. Rob had always assumed these were just poetic ways of describing the soil itself, the foundation of any farmer's livelihood. But now, with that massive metal structure lying partially exposed in his field, those mysterious phrases took on an entirely new significance. Inside the farmhouse, a two-story structure that hadn't seen fresh paint in a decade, Rob went straight to his father's old oak desk, where he kept the journal. As he flipped through its yellowed pages, the financial pressure of recent years weighed heavily on his mind. The bank's foreclosure notice made it clear his options were running out. Modern farming had become a game of scale and capital, leaving little room for family operations like his. Horizon Agricultural Solutions had been systematically buying up struggling properties throughout Oakdale Valley, consolidating them into massive industrial operations where crops were more manufactured than grown. Last month, their representative Andrew Blackwell had made what he called their final generous offer to buy the Jenkins farm, a figure that would clear Rob's debts with just enough left to make a modest new start elsewhere. Many of his neighbors had already accepted similar deals, their family legacies absorbed into Horizon's ever-expanding holdings. The thought of being the first Jenkins to lose the farm made Rob's stomach turn, but the reality was that he was nearly out of options. His son Jack's college acceptance letter was pinned to the refrigerator door, a bittersweet reminder of both pride and pressure. Jack had earned a partial scholarship to study agricultural science at the University of Nebraska, but even with financial aid, the remaining costs were beyond Rob's means. The farm's decline hadn't happened overnight. Like erosion gradually wearing away at fertile topsoil, it had been a process of slow attrition. First came the rising costs of equipment and supplies, then several seasons of unpredictable weather. Too wet one year, bone dry the next. The loans piled up, each carrying a higher interest rate than the last as his credit rating deteriorated. The final blow had been the collapse of corn prices 2 seasons ago, leaving him unable to even cover his operating costs. From his kitchen window, Rob could see Horizon's massive grain elevators rising in the distance like modern-day castles. Their offers had become increasingly aggressive, and their representatives never failed to remind him that his situation would only worsen with time. "The era of the family farm is over," Blackwell had told him during their last meeting, not with malice, but with the dispassionate tone of someone stating an inevitable fact. The discovery of the mysterious metal structure had temporarily pushed these worries to the background. For the first time in years, Rob felt something different, a spark of curiosity and possibility. Whatever lay buried in his field had been there for generations, waiting. Perhaps it had been waiting specifically for him. Looking back at William's journal, Rob found a passage he'd never fully understood before. The key lies in the pattern of the seasons when the first seed was planted. The words were followed by a series of numbers he'd always assumed were crop yields or rainfall measurements. But looking at them now, they seemed to correspond to the arrangement of symbols on the metal hatch. Rob reached for his phone to call. Someone, perhaps David Cooper, his closest neighbor and one of the few remaining independent farmers in the valley. But something stopped him. His finger hovered over David's name in his contacts, but he couldn't bring himself to make the call. Not yet. Not until he understood more about what he'd found. This was his land, his discovery, and possibly, though the thought seemed almost too desperate to acknowledge, his last chance to save the farm. Taking a deep breath, Rob made a decision. He'd investigate this himself, at least initially. If it turned out to be something dangerous or historically significant, he could always call in the authorities later. But first, he needed to understand what his great-grandfather had considered important enough to bury and protect. Rob spent the remainder of the day gathering tools he might need: shovels, work lights, his old rock-climbing ropes from his college days, and a portable generator. He also grabbed his grandfather's old Polaroid camera. If he was going to document his findings, he wanted to do it in a way that couldn't be immediately shared digitally. Years of dealing with Horizon had made him cautious about what information might leak out. As he worked, Rob formulated a plan. He would wait until dusk to continue his excavation. His field wasn't visible from the main road, and the neighboring farms were far enough away that no one would notice lights or activity after dark. He would use the remaining daylight hours to continue his regular farm work, maintaining appearances while preparing for what might be the most important night of his life. The decision felt both terrifying and right. For years, he'd been a passive participant in his farm's slow decline, watching helplessly as forces beyond his control stripped away his family's legacy piece by piece. But this discovery was something different. For the first time in years, Rob felt like he was taking control of his destiny. As dusk settled over the Nebraska plains, Rob parked his truck strategically to shield his work area from the county road. The autumn air had grown colder, and his breath formed small clouds in the beam of his headlamp. He'd spent the afternoon making preparations while trying to maintain an appearance of normalcy, even waving to Horizon's survey team as they drove past his property on their routine inspection of neighboring lands. Using a metal detector his father had once used to search for old boundary markers, Rob had mapped out the entire underground structure. The circular plate was approximately 15 feet in diameter, and what lay beneath extended at least 12 feet down, based on the detector's readings. He'd marked the boundaries with small flags normally used to mark irrigation lines. Starting at the edge, where his plow had first struck metal, Rob began carefully removing soil with a shovel. Years of maintaining irrigation systems had taught him that hasty excavation often created more problems than it solved. Every few inches, he would sweep away loose dirt with a brush, revealing more of the intricate symbols carved into the metal surface. The symbols themselves were unlike anything he'd ever seen. They weren't Native American in origin, at least not from any tribes he knew had lived in this region. The precision of the carvings suggested they'd been made with advanced tools, not crude instruments. After 2 hours of careful digging, Rob had exposed about a quarter of the circular plate. The symbols formed concentric rings around what appeared to be a central mechanism, something that looked almost like a sophisticated lock or control panel. William's journal had mentioned the sealed promise multiple times, but nothing specific about how to access it. Taking out the Polaroid camera, Rob methodically photographed each section of exposed symbols. The flash cast harsh shadows that made the carvings stand out in stark relief. As he waited for each photo to develop, he carefully copied the symbols into a notebook, trying to detect any patterns or repetitions that might suggest a code or sequence. The central mechanism was particularly intriguing. It appeared to be made of a different metal than the rest of the plate, something that hadn't tarnished despite its years underground. In the beam of his headlamp, it almost seemed to glow with a faint bluish tint. There were what looked like keyholes arranged in a circle, but they were unlike any keyholes he'd ever seen, more geometric, with complex internal structures visible within them. Checking his great-grandfather's journal again, Rob found a passage he'd never paid much attention to before. The promise awakens when summer yields to autumn and the seventh alignment appears. The words were followed by a series of diagrams that he'd always assumed were field planning sketches, but looking at them now, they seemed to correspond to the arrangement of symbols on the plate. Working methodically, Rob began cleaning the central mechanism with small brushes and compressed air from his workshop. Each component seemed to move slightly when pressed, like parts of an elaborate combination lock. The craftsmanship was incredible. Despite being buried for what must have been over a century, the mechanisms moved smoothly without any sign of rust or deterioration. As midnight approached, Rob faced a decision. He'd exposed enough of the structure to attempt opening it, but doing so would be a point of no return. Once the seal was broken, there would be no hiding the fact that someone had discovered and accessed whatever lay below. Taking out his thermos of coffee, he sat on the edge of the excavation and reviewed his photographs. The symbols seemed to tell a story, one that spiraled inward toward the central lock. Some of the sequences repeated, like refrains in a piece of music. His great-grandfather's diagrams might be the key to understanding their pattern. The sound of a distant vehicle caused him to quickly douse his lights. Headlights swept along the main road, then turned onto the dirt track that led to Horizon's grain storage facility, just a night watchman making his rounds. But it was a reminder that he needed to be careful. Rob decided he'd made enough progress. For one night, carefully covering his work with tarps and loose hay, he gathered his tools. He'd confirmed that this was no random structure. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to create this sealed chamber and ensure it could only be opened by someone who understood its secrets. As he drove home in the darkness, his mind was already planning next steps. He would need to decode the symbol sequence, understand his great-grandfather's diagrams, and figure out how the locking mechanism worked. But he also knew he needed to maintain his normal farming routine to avoid arousing suspicion. Horizon's people watched the valley like hawks, always looking for signs that another family farm was failing. Tomorrow, he would return to his regular farm work. But tonight, as he carefully stored the Polaroids and his notes in his father's old gun safe, Rob felt a growing certainty that he was on the verge of uncovering something extraordinary. Whether it would be enough to save his farm remained to be seen, but for the first time in years, he felt hope. The next few days tested Rob's resolve in ways he hadn't anticipated. Each morning he would check the tarps covering his discovery, and each morning the sight of them filled him with a mixture of excitement and growing anxiety. The weather forecast predicted an early winter storm by the end of the week, a development that could severely complicate his covert excavation efforts. But weather wasn't his only concern. Word had somehow gotten out that Horizon Agricultural Solutions was increasing their presence in the valley. 2 more of his neighboring farms had sold out in the past week alone, and the corporate giant surveyors seemed to be everywhere, their white trucks constantly patrolling the back roads as they assessed their newest acquisitions. On the 4th morning after his discovery, Rob noticed fresh tire tracks leading partway into his field, stopping just short of the covered excavation site. Someone had been on his property during the night. The realization sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. He spent the next hour carefully checking his work area, but the tarps appeared undisturbed. Still, the incident forced him to add more camouflage and rethink his timeline. He couldn't afford to wait much longer before attempting to open the structure. The symbols themselves were proving to be another source of frustration. Despite hours spent comparing them to his great-grandfather's journal entries, the pattern continued to elude him. The diagrams William had drawn seemed to correspond to something, but every sequence Rob tried with the central locking mechanism led nowhere. Each failed attempt left him wondering if he was damaging the delicate machinery. Jack called from college that evening, his voice full of enthusiasm about his agricultural science classes. "Dad, you won't believe what we're learning about soil remediation techniques," he said excitedly. "I think I might have some ideas that could help with the farm's eastern field problems." Rob's heart clenched as he listened, knowing that without some miracle, there might not be a farm left by the time Jack graduated. The weight of his secret felt especially heavy during these conversations. That night, as Rob worked by lamplight, at his kitchen table, surrounded by the Polaroids and his notes, a new worry began to gnaw at him. What if there was nothing valuable in the chamber? What if all this effort, all this secrecy was for nothing? Or worse, what if he found something that would only bring more problems? His mind wandered to stories he'd heard about farmers finding Native American artifacts and losing their land to archaeological preservation orders. The thought made his blood run cold. The next morning brought a new complication. His ancient combine harvester, already held together mostly by hope and baling wire, finally gave up the ghost. The timing couldn't have been worse. He needed to maintain appearances of normal farming operations, but he couldn't afford repairs right now. Every dollar he had was tied up in loan payments and the bare minimum needed to prepare for spring planting. As he stood in his equipment shed staring at the disabled combine, Rob noticed something odd about the old toolbox he'd inherited from William. He'd walked past it thousands of times, but now, with his mind attuned to patterns and symbols, he saw that the worn decorative scrollwork around its edges wasn't decorative at all. The marks were weathered almost to invisibility, but they matched some of the symbols on the hidden chamber door. His hands trembling slightly, Rob opened the toolbox. Most of its contents were familiar, the usual assortment of vintage tools and spare parts. But when he removed the upper tray, he found something tucked into a hidden compartment beneath, a small leather pouch containing what looked like metallic puzzle pieces, each inscribed with symbols matching those on the chamber door. The discovery should have been encouraging, but it only added to his anxiety. If these pieces were meant to help open the chamber, why hadn't William left clearer instructions? And why hide them so carefully? The more Rob uncovered, the more questions arose, and the weight of responsibility felt increasingly overwhelming. That afternoon, he received another letter from the bank. They were accelerating his equipment. Loans, citing missed payments and market uncertainty. Without functioning equipment, he had no way to maintain even the appearance of normal operations. The walls were closing in, and time was running out. As dusk approached, Rob stood at the edge of his field, the leather pouch heavy in his pocket. The first clouds of the predicted winter storm had begun to gather on the horizon, and the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of snow. He had a decision to make: wait for better conditions and risk losing everything to the bank and horizon, or push forward tonight despite the weather and increasing surveillance. The complexity of the chamber's locking mechanism suggested that whatever lay within was meant to be protected at all costs, but protected from what or whom? For the first time, Rob wondered if his great-grandfather's silence about the chamber's existence had been meant as a warning rather than a challenge. The storm that hit the valley that night was unlike anything Rob had seen in years. Driving snow reduced visibility to mere feet, and the wind howled with such ferocity that he had to shut off his work lights for fear they would be torn away. But it wasn't just the weather that proved to be a problem. As he struggled to protect the excavation site from the accumulating snow, his phone buzzed with an urgent text from Jack. "Dad, someone from Horizon contacted me about our property's historical survey records. They're offering to sponsor my education if I can get access to great-grandpa's journals. What's going on?" Rob's hands shook as he read the message. Horizon's interest in historical records could only mean one thing. They somehow knew something was different about his property. The random surveying, the nighttime visitors, the increasing pressure from the bank, it all suddenly made terrible sense. They weren't just trying to buy his farm as part of their expansion, they were looking for something specific. Working frantically in the driving snow, Rob managed to rig a makeshift shelter over the chamber's exposed surface, using tarps and lumber from his shed. But as he finished securing the last corner, his headlamp illuminated something that made his blood run cold. There, half buried in the snow, was a small electronic device. Some kind of sensor or tracker that definitely hadn't been there the day before. Checking the perimeter of his property, Rob discovered two more devices hidden in the trees near his field. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't just being watched, he was being monitored professionally. His amateur attempts at secrecy had probably been transparent to whoever was surveilling him. Returning to his house to change, out of his soaked clothes, Rob found his front door slightly ajar. He always locked it, had done so religiously since Emma had passed 5 years ago. Heart pounding, he pushed it open slowly. Nothing seemed obviously disturbed, but years of Living alone had taught him the exact placement of everything in his home. Little things were off. Papers on his desk slightly reshuffled. His great-grandfather's journal moved a fraction of an inch from its usual spot. Someone had been inside, searching for something. Moving quickly, Rob checked the gun safe where he'd been keeping the Polaroids and his notes. The lock showed no signs of tampering, but when he opened it, he knew immediately that the contents had been photographed or scanned. The stack of photos was slightly out of alignment, and one of his notebooks was bent at a different angle. His hands trembling, Rob gathered everything related to the chamber and stuffed it into his father's old army rucksack. He couldn't leave any of it in the house now. But as he was about to close the safe, something caught his eye. A tiny piece of paper had fallen between the safe's inner wall and floor. Fishing it out, he found himself staring at a note written in his great-grandfather's distinctive handwriting. If they come searching, bury everything deeper and salt the earth. Some technologies must remain ungoverned. The cryptic warning sent chills down Rob's spine. For the first time, he wondered if his great-grandfather had hidden the chamber not to preserve something valuable, but to protect the world from something powerful. The symbols, the elaborate locking mechanism, the generations of secrecy. What if it had all been containment rather than conservation? Another crack of lightning illuminated his kitchen, and in that brief flash, Rob saw a figure moving quickly. Past his window, someone was out there, watching his house. His phone buzzed again, another text from Jack. "Dad, 2 men in suits just showed up at my dorm, asking questions about our family history. They had satellite images of our farm from last week. What's happening?" The walls were closing in. Rob had thought he was being careful, but he'd underestimated what he was dealing with. Horizon Agricultural Solutions wasn't just some corporate farming conglomerate. They had resources and capabilities far beyond what he'd imagined, and they'd been looking for the chamber long before his plow had struck metal. As if to confirm his worst fears, he heard the distant sound of vehicles approaching on his access road, multiple vehicles by the sound of it. In that moment, Rob realized he had only minutes to make a decision that would affect not just his future, but potentially much more. Whatever lay in that chamber had been important enough for his great-grandfather to hide completely and protect with warnings written in code. Just as Rob heard the vehicles pulling up to his property, his phone rang. Not Jack this time, but David Cooper, his elderly neighbor whose family had farmed the adjacent property since before the Jenkins arrived in the valley. David's voice was urgent, none of his usual casual drawl. "Rob, I'm looking at 3 black SUVs headed your way. Those aren't Horizon's regular people. Get to my place through the old storm cellar tunnel now." The storm cellar tunnel, Rob had almost forgotten about it. During Prohibition, the farmers in the valley had created an underground network to help each other avoid federal agents. Most of the tunnels had collapsed over the years, but the one connecting his property to Cooper's had been maintained as an emergency route during tornado season. Grabbing his rucksack and his great-grandfather's journal, Rob slipped out his cellar door just as headlights swept across his front yard. The entrance to the tunnel was hidden behind a false wall in the cellar's root storage area. A secret. David's father had shown Rob's dad years ago as part of the valley's unwritten history. The tunnel was narrow and damp, barely tall enough to stand in. Rob's headlamp revealed generations of cobwebs as he moved as quickly as he dared through the darkness. Behind him, he could hear muffled voices and the sound of car doors slamming. They would find the tunnel eventually. It was just a question of how long it would take them. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 minutes, Rob emerged through a similar false wall in the Cooper cellar. David was waiting for him, shotgun in hand, looking grimmer than Rob had ever seen him. "They've been watching all of us," David said without preamble, "ever since they started buying up farms in the valley. But you found something, didn't you? Something they've been looking for." Before Rob could respond, David's wife Margaret hurried down the cellar stairs. "They're at the house," she said quietly. "4 men in suits, showing some kind of federal badges, asking about unusual structures or historic sites in the valley." David's expression hardened. Badges can be faked, and even if they're real, that doesn't mean they're on the right side of this. He turned to Rob. "Your great-grandfather William wasn't the only one who left warnings. My grandfather had notes about something hidden in the valley, something important enough that people would come looking eventually." Moving quickly, David pulled out an old leather-bound ledger from behind a loose stone in the cellar wall. The original settlers in this valley, they chose this place for a reason. The farm sales, the surveys, the sudden interest in local history. It's all been built into this. Horizon isn't just buying land, they're searching for something specific. Rob spread out his great-grandfather's journal and the photos of the chamber symbols. David studied them intently, then began flipping through his ledger. These markings, they're not just decorative, they're part of a larger system. Your great-grandfather was part of a group that hid something important, something they thought would be dangerous in the wrong hands. Each family was given part of the information needed to access it, but no one family had the complete key. Margaret, who had been keeping watch at the top of the cellar stairs, called down quietly, "They're starting to search the outbuildings, and more vehicles are arriving." David's weathered hands moved quickly as he copied something from his ledger into Rob's notebook. "This is our family's part of the sequence. Combined with your symbols and the pieces you found, it might be enough to open the chamber." "But Rob, are you sure you want to? Our grandparents went to incredible lengths to keep this hidden." A sudden banging from above made them all jump. Voices could be heard in the Cooper's kitchen. "Mr. Cooper, federal agents, we need to speak with you immediately." David grabbed Rob's arm. "There's another tunnel, older one, leads to the old Mitchell place. Harold Mitchell is still alive in the Millbrook nursing home. James Mitchell's grandfather used to maintain the records for the original families. If anyone would know more about what's hidden on your land, it would be him." Margaret quickly gathered some supplies, flashlights, water, some food, and stuffed them into Rob's rucksack. "The tunnel entrance is behind the wine rack," she whispered. "Once you're in, go left at every junction. It's about a mile to the Mitchell place. And Rob, be careful. Whatever's in that chamber, there are clearly people willing to go to extreme lengths to find it." As Rob prepared to enter the second tunnel, David pressed a small wooden box into his hands. "Family heirloom. Never knew what it was for, but the markings match your photos. Now go. We'll stall them as long as we can." The sound of footsteps on the cellar stairs spurred Rob into action. As he slipped behind the wine rack and found the hidden door, he could hear David's voice, loud and annoyed, confronting the agents about searching private property without a warrant. The old farmer was buying him time, but how much? The tunnel to the Mitchell place was older and narrower than the one he'd just traveled, with roots breaking through the earth walls and ceiling. As Rob made his way through the darkness, David's wooden box tucked safely in his rucksack, his mind raced with the implications of what he'd just learned. The original farming families had chosen Oakdale Valley deliberately, working together to protect something so important that its secrecy had been maintained across generations. After nearly an hour of careful progress through the narrow tunnel, Rob finally emerged into the Mitchell's old root cellar. The farmhouse above had been abandoned for years, ever since Harold Mitchell had moved to the Millbrook nursing home. Dust motes danced in the beam of his flashlight, and the musty scent of neglect filled the air. Every creak of the settling house above made him freeze, straining to hear if it was just the wind or something more ominous. Using his phone's flashlight to supplement his failing headlamp, Rob found his way to Harold Mitchell's study. The room remained exactly as he remembered it from childhood visits, walls lined with books and historical documents about the valley. But now, with everything he'd learned, Rob looked at it with new eyes. What had seemed like an old man's harmless fascination with local history might actually have been something far more deliberate. Working quickly, Rob began examining the books and papers, looking for anything that might connect to the chamber or the symbols. In the beam of his flashlight, something caught his eye. A faded photograph hanging on the wall showing Oakdale, Valley's original farming families. His great-grandfather William was there, standing next to David's grandfather and Harold's father. But it was what they were standing in front of that made Rob's breath catch. The photograph showed what appeared to be a construction site, in the same location where he'd found the chamber. In the image, a massive circular structure was being lowered into a deep excavation. The men in the photo were all wearing unusual medallions around their necks, each bearing symbols similar to those on the metal door. This wasn't just some random artifact. This had been a deliberate, coordinated effort by the Valley's founding families. Searching more urgently now, Rob found a loose floorboard beneath the old desk. Inside the hidden compartment was a leather-bound volume, its cover marked with the same symbols he'd seen on the chamber door. His hands trembling with excitement, he opened it and found pages of detailed diagrams and notes, all relating to the chamber's construction and its intricate locking mechanism. But it was more than just technical drawings. The book contained what appeared to be a warning, written in several languages. The innovation within must remain sealed until the time of greatest necessity. To activate it prematurely risks corruption of its purpose. The chamber guards both salvation and potential misuse, which it becomes depends on when and by whom it is discovered. As Rob studied the diagrams, pieces began falling into place. The symbols weren't just decorative or even a simple code. They were components of an agricultural calculation system. The pattern of the seasons his great-grandfather had mentioned wasn't just poetic language. It was a literal reference to planting cycles and harvest yields. The chamber could only be opened when specific agricultural conditions were met, using tools crafted for exactly that purpose. Rob examined the wooden box David had given him more carefully. What he'd initially taken for decorative carving was actually an almanac calculation device showing optimal planting conditions. When he pressed certain points on the device, parts of the box shifted and moved, revealing a complex mechanism inside. This wasn't just a key, it was a calibration tool designed to confirm the proper method for opening the chamber. As he made these discoveries, Rob heard vehicles on the road outside. The search was expanding systematically, and the Mitchell farm would be an obvious location to check. But now he had what he needed: the technical diagrams, the purpose of the symbols, and most importantly, understanding of why the chamber had been sealed in the first place. Using the old tunnel network, he could make his way back to his farm before dawn. But the real question wasn't whether he could open the chamber, it was whether he should. The warning in the book was clear about the dangers of activating whatever lay inside before its time. Yet something told him that this wasn't a coincidence. Finding the chamber now, when corporate giants were swallowing up family farms across the country, when the very way of life his great-grandfather had helped establish was under threat, perhaps this was exactly the time of greatest necessity the warning referred to. Gathering everything he'd found, Rob prepared to return through the tunnel. He had roughly 4 hours until dawn, 4 hours to make it back to his farm, avoid Horizon's people, and make a decision that could change everything. His future, his son's future, and perhaps the future of farming itself, hung in the balance of what he would find beneath his field. The journey back through the tunnel network was more treacherous than before. Rob could hear vehicles and voices above ground. They were systematically searching every property in the valley, but the knowledge he'd gained at the Mitchell farm drove him forward. Whatever was in that chamber, multiple generations of valley families had dedicated themselves to protecting it. Using the drainage tunnels, Rob emerged in his field just yards from the chamber site. The makeshift shelter he'd constructed earlier had been torn down, and powerful portable lights now illuminated the entire area. But surprisingly, no one was there. The searchers had moved on to other parts of his property, giving him a narrow window of opportunity. Working quickly, Rob examined the chamber's central locking mechanism with new understanding. The agricultural diagrams from Mitchell's book showed that each ring of symbols corresponded to a specific seasonal event: planting dates, first frost, harvest time. When he held David's wooden calculation device over the mechanism, the markings aligned perfectly with the chamber's symbols. As he worked, a memory surfaced, something Jack had said years ago while studying agricultural history for a school project. The seeds tell us when, but the soil tells us where. Looking at the chamber symbols again, Rob suddenly understood. The seasonal alignments weren't just about timing, they were coordinates pointing to this exact spot in the valley. The founding families hadn't chosen Oakdale Valley randomly. Something about this specific soil, this specific location, had been essential to whatever they were protecting. With trembling hands, Rob began adjusting the rings according to the calculations in Mitchell's book. Each correct position produced a faint click, like tumblers falling in a lock. But it was what he found beneath the final ring that made his heart nearly stop. There, previously hidden, was a small metal plate bearing his family's name, Jenkins, and beside it an inscription: "To the guardians of the seed, when the land cries out and hope withers, the renewal begins." The meaning struck him with sudden clarity. The chamber wasn't hiding something dangerous, it was protecting something precious. His great-grandfather's journal entries about the sealed promise and the inheritance beneath took on new meaning. The original farming families hadn't just chosen this valley randomly. They'd chosen it to protect something vital to agriculture itself. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the valley, Rob inserted the core of David's wooden device into the central mechanism. The agricultural calculator aligned perfectly with the symbols, and a deep, resonating hum began to emerge from beneath the ground. The sound grew stronger, and the entire metal surface began to shift and move in ways that seemed to defy conventional engineering. Segments of the chamber's cover retracted and rotated, revealing a spiraling staircase descending into darkness. The air that emerged was neither stale nor cold, but carried a strange, almost sweet scent that made Rob think of springtime and fresh growth. Taking out his flashlight, Rob began to descend the stairs. They were pristine, showing no signs of age despite being sealed for over a century. The walls were covered in more symbols, but these told a story. Images of crops failing, of dust storms and devastation, followed by renewal and rebirth. At the bottom of the stairs, Rob entered a circular chamber that took his breath away. The walls were lined with what looked like glass cylinders, each containing seeds and seedlings suspended in a clear liquid that seemed to glow with its own inner light. But these weren't ordinary plants. Even to his experienced farmer's eye, they were like nothing he'd ever seen before. In the center of the chamber stood a pedestal with an open book. Its pages were covered in scientific formulas and agricultural diagrams far more advanced than anything that should have existed in his great-grandfather's time. This was why Horizon Agricultural Solutions had been so interested in the valley. Somehow, they'd learned about this chamber and its contents. The book detailed something extraordinary. These were hardy, disease-resistant strains of various crops developed using techniques that modern science was only beginning to understand. The plants in the cylinders were designed to survive drought, resist pests, and produce abundant yields without chemical fertilizers. They were, in essence, a complete solution to the problems facing modern agriculture. But more importantly, they were meant to be freely available. The book was explicit about this. These seeds were intended to help independent farmers resist the consolidation of agricultural power. They were meant to be discovered at a time when corporate farming threatened to completely take over, providing a way for family farms to survive and compete. The final pages of the book contained a warning that made Rob's hands shake. This knowledge was hidden because the world wasn't ready. Those who would profit from scarcity would have destroyed it. When you find this, it means the time has come for renewal. But beware, there are still those who would prefer these secrets remain buried. The sound of vehicles approaching snapped Rob back to reality. The sun had risen fully now, casting long shadows through the chamber's entrance. He could hear Horizon's people returning, their voices carrying down into the chamber, but he was no longer afraid. What he'd found wasn't just a solution to his own problems. It was hope for every independent farmer fighting to survive. Working. Quickly, Rob used his phone to document everything: the formulas, the seed preservation techniques, the advanced agricultural methods. He carefully collected samples from each cylinder, storing them in his rucksack using the special containers he found in the chamber. Above ground, he could hear David Cooper's voice, loud and clear. "You have no right to be here. This is private property." Other voices joined in. More of the valley's remaining independent farmers creating a diversion. They were buying him and time, just as their grandparents had worked together to protect this chamber decades ago. As Rob prepared to leave the chamber, he noticed one final hidden compartment in the pedestal. Inside was a letter from his great-grandfather, William, addressed to whoever would find the chamber. "To my descendant who discovers this in their time of need. What we protected here is more than seeds and science. It is hope freely given." The corporations of our time sought to control food itself, to own the very means of survival. We could not let that happen. These seeds and the knowledge that accompanies them belong to all people. Use them wisely, share them freely. The earth provides for all, not just the powerful few. Emerging from the chamber, Rob found himself surrounded by Horizon's agents and men in dark suits. But behind them stood the valley's farmers, David Cooper, the Williamsons, the Parkers, and dozens more. Some he hadn't seen in years, but they'd all come, drawn by David's urgent calls and a generations-old promise to protect the chamber. "Mr. Jenkins," one of the suits stepped forward, "what you found is proprietary technology. We'll need you to turn over everything you've removed from that chamber." Rob stood straight, his great-grandfather's journal in one hand, his rucksack full of precious samples in the other. "No," he said simply. "This belongs to everyone, just like the air we breathe and the sun that shines. You can't own it, and you can't hide it anymore." Jack's voice cut through the tension. He'd arrived sometime during the confrontation and now stood recording everything with his phone, live streaming to his university's agricultural science forum. "It's too late," he called out. "The formulas, the techniques, they're already uploaded. Thousands of people are seeing this right now. Agricultural students, independent farmers, researchers, everyone." The suited men's faces fell as they checked their phones, seeing the truth of Jack's words. The secret was out. What had been hidden in the chamber was already spreading across the internet, being shared by farmers and scientists worldwide. In the days that followed, the story of the Oakdale Valley Chamber and its contents became global news. Agricultural. Experts confirmed that the techniques preserved in the chamber were revolutionary, sustainable farming methods that could transform agriculture while breaking corporate monopolies on seed patents. Rob's farm became a center for learning as farmers from across the country came to study the rediscovered techniques. The Jenkins family legacy had evolved from protecting the chamber to sharing its knowledge. Jack's university established a research center in the valley dedicated to developing and freely sharing agricultural innovations. Horizon Agricultural Solutions' attempt to monopolize the valley had failed, but something more important had succeeded: the vision of the original farming families who had hidden these secrets so long ago. They had preserved hope for a future where farming remained in the hands of those who worked the land. Standing in his field months later, watching new crops grow using the chamber's methods, Rob finally understood the full meaning of his great-grandfather's words. Some technologies must remain ungoverned. They had never meant to hide this knowledge forever, only until the right time came to let it grow. The eastern field that had once been called the Troubled Acre now flourished with experimental crops based on the chamber's seedlings. The plants grew vigorously despite minimal water and no chemical fertilizers, their vibrant green standing in stark contrast to the conventional crops in neighboring fields. Graduate students from agricultural programs across the country had set up a research station on the corner of his property, systematically documenting the extraordinary properties of these rediscovered crop varieties. 6 months had passed since Rob had opened the chamber, and the ripple effects continued to spread far beyond Oakdale Valley. The foreclosure notices had stopped coming, not because Rob had suddenly become wealthy, but because the Jenkins farm had been designated a living agricultural heritage site, protected by a new international treaty governing open-source seed preservation. The agreement, drafted with unprecedented speed by an alliance of nations concerned about food security, ensured that no single corporation could monopolize the genetic material recovered from the chamber. Richard Sullivan, the CEO of Horizon Agricultural Solutions, had made one final visit to the farm, arriving not in a corporate SUV, but in a modest rental car, alone and without his usual entourage. Rob had found him standing at the edge of the eastern field, staring at the experimental crops with a complex expression, part wonder, part regret. "You know, my grandfather was a farmer," Sullivan had said without preamble. 50 acres in western Iowa, lost everything in the 1980s farm crisis. That's why I went into agribusiness, thought I could change the system from within. He turned to Rob then, his corporate polish momentarily stripped away. "We were looking for exactly this, but not to share it. The board wanted proprietary control, exclusive patents. I convinced myself it was the only way to fund the research." Rob had said nothing, letting the man's confession hang in the air between them. After a long moment, Sullivan had handed him a business card. "The company's restructuring, new leadership, new mission. We're establishing an open-source seed division. When you're ready to talk, call me." Inside the farmhouse, the kitchen table that had once been covered with past due notices and foreclosure threats now overflowed with research papers, correspondence from farmers around the world, and handwritten notes from people whose livelihoods had been transformed by the chamber's contents. Jack had taken a semester off from university, determined to document everything properly before returning to complete his degree. His professors had enthusiastically approved the arrangement, recognizing the educational value of his first-hand participation in what was being called the most significant agricultural discovery of the century. More remarkable than the scientific breakthroughs was the revival of community in Oakdale Valley. Farms that had been sold to Horizon were gradually being reacquired by farming families as the corporation divested certain holdings under public and regulatory pressure. A cooperative formed among the valley's independent farmers, pooling resources to process and distribute crops grown from the chamber's seeds. The Millbrook Farmers Market, which had dwindled to just 3 vendors in recent years, now bustled, with activity every Saturday as people drove from hundreds of miles away to purchase the exceptional produce. David and Margaret Cooper had become unofficial historians of the chamber, meticulously organizing the documents recovered from various family archives. Their work revealed that the founding families of Oakdale Valley had not been typical homesteaders, but a specialized group including agricultural scientists, botanists, and engineers who had fled the increasing corporatization of farming in the late 19th century. They had pooled their knowledge to develop crop varieties resistant to the pests, diseases, and climate fluctuations they predicted would threaten food security in the future. They were far ahead of their time, David explained one evening as several families gathered in Rob's living room. They understood soil microbiomes and plant genetics decades before mainstream science, but they also recognized the danger of their discoveries in the wrong hands. The chamber wasn't just a seed vault, it was a time capsule intended for a moment when agriculture faced an existential threat. Harold Mitchell, despite his advanced age and fragile health, had become revitalized by the chamber's discovery. Now residing back in his family home, restored with help from the community, he spent his days translating the more cryptic documents found in the chamber. His mind, previously clouded by isolation and lack of purpose, had sharpened remarkably, once given meaningful work. The symbols aren't just a locking mechanism, he explained to Rob and Jack during one of their weekly visits. They're a complete agricultural calendar system. Our ancestors developed a method to predict optimal planting conditions based on soil composition, cosmic alignments, and weather patterns. Modern meteorology is just now catching up to what they understood intuitively. The chamber itself had been carefully preserved, its entrance rebuilt with a proper structure that protected it from the elements while allowing controlled access for research purposes. The spiral staircase leading down to the main storage area had been reinforced, and solar-powered lighting now illuminated the remarkable space that had remained hidden for over a century. The agricultural formulas and preservation techniques documented in the chamber's books had been digitized and made available through an open-access scientific database, though certain sections, particularly those relating to potentially harmful applications, were released only to credentialed researchers who agreed to specific ethical guidelines. Most meaningful to Rob were the quiet moments when he would stand at the edge of his fields watching the sunset, feeling a connection to his great-grandfather William that transcended time. He understood now the burden William had carried, the knowledge that could have transformed agriculture in his lifetime, but which he had chosen to protect rather than exploit. The journal passages about the sealed promise and the inheritance beneath weren't just poetic language. They were a message across generations, a trust passed down until the right moment arrived. One evening, as Rob and Jack sat on the porch, reviewing plans for the spring planting, Jack asked the question that had been lingering in both their minds. Do you think they knew exactly when the chamber would be discovered? Did they somehow plan for it to be found precisely when it was needed most? Rob considered this as he looked out over the fields where the first green shoots of winter wheat were emerging, a heritage variety restored from the chamber's seed bank, already showing remarkable vigor despite the challenging conditions. I don't think they knew exactly when, he said finally, but they understood cycles in farming, in economics, in human nature. They recognized that the consolidation of agricultural power they were witnessing in their time would eventually reach a critical point. They didn't hide these seeds to keep them from the world forever. They preserved them until the world was ready to use them wisely. Jack nodded, turning a small metal object over in his hands, one of the intricate components from the chamber's locking mechanism that had become his unofficial good luck charm. It's strange to think that our family has been guarding this secret for generations without even knowing it. Not just our family, Rob corrected gently. Every family in this valley played a part, whether they realized it or not. That's what makes these seeds different from anything Horizon could have developed. They weren't created by a single genius or a corporate research team. They represent the collective wisdom of people who understood that farming isn't just about efficiency and profit. It's about sustainability and community. They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell, the temperature dropping with the characteristic swiftness of a Nebraska autumn evening. In the distance, lights glowed from the Cooper farm and other neighboring homesteads, properties that had been on the verge of foreclosure just months ago, now renewed with purpose and possibility. The bank loan that had once seemed an insurmountable burden had been restructured under terms that recognized the Jenkins farm's cultural and scientific significance. The equipment that had been barely functional was gradually being replaced, not with the latest corporate models, but with innovative machinery designed collaboratively by engineering students and farmers, built specifically to work with the unique properties of the heritage crops. Rob had received offers from major publishers for his story, and television producers had approached about documentary rights. He had declined them all, preferring instead to document the journey in his own way by continuing his great-grandfather's. He journaled, recording not just the technical details of the chamber's discovery, but the human story of its impact on the community. There was still resistance from the industrial agriculture establishment. Questions had been raised about the safety and viability of the chamber's seed varieties, despite extensive independent testing confirming their exceptional properties. Lobbyists pushed for regulations that would limit the spread of unverified crop varieties, thinly veiled attempts to restrict what had already become a grassroots agricultural revolution. But for every corporate obstacle, there emerged grassroots solutions. Farmers around the world had begun establishing their own seed exchanges based on the Oakdale model. Agricultural colleges had revised their curricula to include study of the chamber's sustainable techniques. Even some former executives from companies like Horizon had defected, choosing to apply their expertise to developing infrastructure for this more democratic vision of farming. One unexpected development had been the arrival of indigenous agricultural experts from various nations, who recognized in the chamber's methods echoes of their own traditional farming practices. Your ancestors rediscovered what our ancestors never forgot, a Cherokee farmer had told Rob during a knowledge-sharing gathering. The relationship between people and plants isn't meant to be one of domination, but of reciprocity. The resulting collaboration had enriched understanding of the chamber's contents, revealing dimensions of the preservation techniques that might otherwise have remained obscure. The most profound transformation, however, had been within Rob himself. The man who had once seen himself as the last in a failing line, the end of the Jenkins farming tradition, now understood his place in a much larger story. He wasn't just farming land, he was stewarding knowledge, cultivating not just crops, but possibilities. "We should update the farm sign," Jack suggested as they prepared to head inside for the night. Jenkins' family farm doesn't quite capture it anymore. Rob smiled, thinking of the weathered wooden sign that had stood at the entrance to their property for as long as he could remember. "What did you have in mind?" Jack gestured toward the eastern field, where they had first discovered the chamber. "Something that honors what we found and what we're doing with it now. Something that connects past and future." Rob nodded, understanding exactly what his son meant. The chamber hadn't just been a repository of seeds, it had been a vessel of hope, deliberately preserved for a moment when it would be most needed. Now that hope was taking root, growing into something that neither William Jenkins nor any of the chamber's original creators could have fully envisioned. Jenkins' heritage farm, Rob suggested. Guardians of the seed. Jack smiled. Perfect. The phrase from the chamber's inscription seemed fitting not just for their family, but for all those who had chosen to participate in this renewed vision of agriculture. one where knowledge was shared rather than hoarded, where abundance flowed from cooperation rather than competition. They were all, in their way, guardians of something precious that had been entrusted to them not as owners, but as caretakers. As they headed inside, Rob's phone buzzed with yet another message from a farmer in Australia who had successfully adapted one of the chamber's drought-resistant wheat varieties to the challenging conditions of the outback. The accompanying photo showed children standing beside healthy golden crops in a landscape where conventional wisdom said nothing should grow. This was the true legacy of the chamber, not just the seeds themselves, but the ripples of possibility spreading outward, taking root in distant soils, flourishing in ways its creators could never have specifically foreseen, but had somehow, in their wisdom, prepared for. In the morning, Rob would continue the work of planting, harvesting, and sharing, the eternal cycles of agriculture that had sustained humanity since the beginning. But now these ancient rhythms carried new meaning, informed by the knowledge that had been preserved beneath his fields for generations, waiting for the moment when the troubled acre would finally reveal its extraordinary secret. The meaning struck Rob with sudden clarity. The chamber wasn't hiding something dangerous, it was protecting something precious. His great-grandfather's journal entries about the sealed promise and the inheritance beneath took on new meaning. The original farming families hadn't just chosen this valley randomly, they'd chosen it to protect something vital to agriculture itself. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the valley, Rob inserted the core of David's wooden device into the central mechanism. The agricultural calculator aligned perfectly with the symbols, and a deep, resonating hum began to emerge from beneath the ground. The sound grew stronger, and the entire metal surface began to shift and move in ways that seemed to defy conventional engineering. Segments of the chamber's cover retracted and rotated, revealing a spiraling staircase descending into darkness. The air that emerged was neither stale nor cold, but carried a strange, almost sweet scent that made Rob think of springtime and fresh growth. Taking out his flashlight, Rob began to descend the stairs. They were pristine, showing no signs of age despite being sealed for over a century. The walls were covered in more symbols, but these told a story. Images of crops failing, of dust storms and devastation, followed by renewal and rebirth. At the bottom of the stairs, Rob entered a deep circular chamber that took his breath away. The walls were lined with what looked like glass cylinders, each containing seeds and seedlings suspended in a clear liquid that seemed to glow with its own inner light. But these weren't ordinary plants. Even to his experienced farmer's eye, they were like nothing he'd ever seen before. In the center of the chamber stood a pedestal with an open book. Its pages were covered in scientific formulas and agricultural diagrams, far more advanced than anything that should have existed in his great-grandfather's time. This was why Horizon Agricultural Solutions had been so interested in the valley. Somehow, they'd learned about this chamber and its contents. The book detailed something extraordinary. These were hardy, disease-resistant strains of various crops developed using techniques that modern science was only beginning to understand. The plants in the cylinders were designed to survive drought, resist pests, and produce abundant yields without chemical fertilizers. They were, in essence, a complete solution to the problems facing modern agriculture. But more importantly, they were meant to be freely available. The book was explicit about this. These seeds were intended to help independent farmers resist the consolidation of agricultural power. They were meant to be discovered at a time when corporate farming threatened to completely take over, providing a way for family farms to survive and compete. The final pages of the book contained a warning that made Rob's hands shake. This knowledge was hidden because the world wasn't ready. Those who would profit from scarcity would have destroyed it. When you find this, It means the time has come for renewal, but beware, there are still those who would prefer these secrets remain buried. The sound of vehicles approaching snapped Rob back to reality. The sun had risen fully now, casting long shadows through the chamber's entrance. He could hear Horizon's people returning, their voices carrying down into the chamber. But he was no longer afraid. What he'd found wasn't just a solution to his own problems. It was hope for every independent farmer fighting to survive. Working quickly, Rob used his phone to document everything. The formulas, the seed preservation techniques, the advanced agricultural methods. He carefully collected samples from each cylinder, storing them in his rucksack using the special containers he found in the chamber. Above ground, he could hear David Cooper's voice, loud and clear. "You have no right to be here. This is private property." Other voices joined in. More of the valley's remaining independent farmers creating a diversion. They were buying him time, just as their grandparents had worked together to protect this chamber decades ago. As Rob prepared to leave the chamber, he noticed one final hidden compartment in the pedestal. Inside was a letter from his great-grandfather, William, addressed to whoever would find the chamber. "To my descendant who discovers this in their time of need, what we protected here is more than seeds and science. It is hope freely given. The corporations of our time sought to control food itself, to own the very means of survival. We could not let that happen. These seeds and the knowledge that accompanies them belong to all people. Use them wisely, share them freely. The earth provides for all, not just the powerful few." The letter was dated 1899, just 2 years after William had established the farm. Rob carefully folded it and placed it in his pocket, feeling the weight of generations resting upon him. He was not just Rob Jenkins, struggling farmer. He was the culmination of a century-long plan, the guardian who had been entrusted with this extraordinary legacy precisely when it was most needed. Gathering the last of the samples and securing the book of formulas in his rucksack, Rob made his way up the spiral staircase. The voices above had grown louder, more insistent. He could make out Andrew Blackwell from Horizon among them, his corporate smoothness now replaced with uncharacteristic urgency. "Mr. Cooper, this is a matter of national agricultural security. We have authorization to access any structures on these properties," Blackwell was saying, his voice strained. "You have papers for my land, not the Jenkins place," David responded stubbornly. "And even if you did, you'd need Rob's permission, which you don't have." Rob emerged from the chamber into the harsh light of morning to find a standoff unfolding. On his field, David and Margaret Cooper stood shoulder to shoulder with at least a dozen other local farmers, forming a human barrier between Horizon's team and the chamber entrance. Behind Blackwell stood 4 men in dark suits who didn't have the look of agricultural corporate representatives. Their stances and alertness suggested government or private security backgrounds. As Rob appeared, all eyes turned to him. The expressions on the faces of his neighbors ranged from concern to curiosity to outright awe as they took in the open chamber behind him. The atmosphere was electric with tension. "Mr. Jenkins," Blackwell stepped forward, his voice attempting to regain its professional calm. "I see you've managed to access the subterranean structure. We need to secure that site immediately for proper scientific assessment." "Proper scientific assessment," Rob repeated, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "Is that what Horizon calls stealing technology that was meant to be shared freely?" Blackwell's eyes narrowed slightly. "I don't know what you think you've found down there, but I can assure you that any agricultural innovations discovered on these properties fall under our exploratory rights agreement with the county." "An agreement made under false pretenses," Rob countered, his voice growing stronger. "You knew about this all along. That's why Horizon has been buying up every farm in the valley, not for the land, but for what's beneath it. A flash of something. Guilt, perhaps, or simple frustration at being exposed, crossed Blackwell's face before he regained his composure. "Mr. Jenkins, you're in over your head. Whatever you think you've discovered has implications far beyond your understanding. Our research division has been tracking anomalous crop yields in this valley for decades. What's in that chamber needs to be studied by professionals, not the very people it was designed to help." Rob interrupted. He turned to the assembled farmers. "My great-grandfather and your ancestors created this. They were agricultural scientists, engineers, visionaries who saw what was coming, the monopolization of our food supply, the patenting of seeds, the slow death of the family farm. They developed something extraordinary and hid it here, protecting it until it was needed most." Margaret Cooper stepped forward, her weathered face solemn. "My grandfather used to say that the soil of this valley held a promise that would be kept when the time was right. We always thought it was just an old man's poetic way of talking about farming." "It was more than that," Rob said, his voice carrying across the quiet field. "They created seed varieties that can withstand drought, resist pests, and produce abundant yields without chemical fertilizers or corporate control. And they left explicit instructions that these innovations were meant to be shared freely, not locked away in some corporate patent portfolio." One of the dark-suited men moved toward Blackwell, speaking quietly in his ear. Blackwell's expression darkened, and he stepped forward again. "Mr. Jenkins, those men behind me represent certain government interests that have been partnering with Horizon. What you've found has national security implications. You need to turn over everything you've collected and step aside." The confrontation might have escalated further, but a new sound cut through the tension, the rumble of approaching vehicles. All eyes turned toward the farm's access road, where a caravan of trucks and cars was approaching, kicking up dust along the dirt track. Jack was in the lead vehicle, his university pickup truck bouncing over the uneven ground. Behind him came what appeared to be a news van with a satellite dish mounted on top, followed by several cars bearing university emblems, and what looked like official government vehicles, but not the unmarked type that accompanied Blackwell. The next several hours passed in a whirlwind of activity, with university researchers, state agricultural officials, and even federal representatives converging on the Jenkins farm. Rob found himself at the center of a storm of questions, documentation, and impromptu meetings. By late afternoon, temporary floodlights had been set up around the chamber entrance and a security perimeter established to protect what was now being called the most significant agricultural discovery of the century. Richard Sullivan, the CEO of Horizon Agricultural Solutions, arrived by helicopter just before sunset. Unlike Blackwell's aggressive approach, Sullivan presented himself as reasonable and conciliatory. "Mr. Jenkins," he said, extending his hand. As they stood at the edge of the field, "I want to personally apologize for the way our company has handled this situation. There's clearly been a misunderstanding about our intentions." Rob didn't take the offered hand. "A misunderstanding? Your company has been systematically forcing family farms out of business across this valley, all while secretly searching out for this chamber. There's no misunderstanding about that." Sullivan's smile remained fixed, though his eyes hardened slightly. "We're in a competitive industry, Mr. Jenkins. Agricultural innovation is how we feed the world. Surely you can appreciate that we have a responsibility to develop and protect advanced technologies that can address global food security." "Protect," Rob repeated. "That's an interesting choice of words. My ancestors protected these seeds and techniques for over a century, not to monopolize them, but to ensure they wouldn't be monopolized." Before Sullivan could respond, they were interrupted by Dr. Eleanor Walsh, the chief agricultural scientist from the state university, who had been examining the contents of the chamber for the past several hours. Mr. Jenkins, she said, her voice trembling slightly with excitement, the preliminary analysis of these seed varieties is, well, it's revolutionary. The drought resistance alone is beyond anything in current agricultural science, and the natural pest resistance mechanisms, they're elegant solutions that we've been attempting to engineer for decades. Sullivan immediately shifted his attention. Dr. Walsh, Horizon would be very interested in partnering with your department on the development of these varieties. Our research facilities are state-of-the-art, and we have distribution networks that could bring these innovations to market quickly. Walsh glanced at Rob before responding. That's not my decision to make, Mr. Sullivan. Based on the historical documentation found in the chamber, these agricultural innovations were explicitly intended to remain in the public domain. Any research partnership would need to honor that intention. Sullivan's smile became strained. Public domain is a noble concept, Dr. Walsh, but bringing agricultural innovations to scale requires substantial investment. The kind of investment that only comes with certain protections of intellectual property, which is exactly what my great-grandfather and the others were trying to prevent, Rob interjected. They saw this coming. Corporations claiming ownership of the very food we eat, the seeds we plant. That's why they developed these varieties and preservation techniques in secret, to ensure they would remain beyond corporate control. The conversation was interrupted by State Agricultural Commissioner Judith Rawlins, who had arrived with the governor's chief of staff. After a brief introduction, she addressed the growing tension between Rob and the Horizon CEO. Mr. Sullivan, my office has been monitoring Horizon's land acquisition patterns in this region for some time. In light of today's discovery, I'm initiating a formal review of all contracts and agreements your company has made with local farmers over the past 5 years. Sullivan's facade of friendly cooperation cracked slightly. Commissioner, Horizon has operated entirely within legal boundaries. Our acquisitions are standard business practices in modern agriculture. Perhaps, Rawlins replied coolly, but there's nothing standard about systematically targeting properties based on confidential historical information about a hidden agricultural repository, particularly when that targeting has involved questionable lending practices and pressure tactics against financially vulnerable family farms. As night fell over the Jenkins farm, a remarkable transformation had taken place. The field that had once represented Rob's desperate last hope for financial survival had become the focal point of what many were already calling an agricultural revolution. Teams of researchers worked under bright lights, carefully documenting and analyzing the chamber's contents. Media crews captured footage for national broadcasts, interviewing local farmers about the valley's hidden history. Rob found Jack sitting on the porch steps of their farmhouse, watching the activity from a distance. "How are you holding up?" Rob asked, settling beside his son. Jack shook his head in amazement. "It's surreal. Yesterday we were worried about losing the farm. Today people are talking about how we might have just changed the future of agriculture." "Not us," Rob corrected gently. "Your great-great-grandfather and the other founding families. We're just the messengers." Jack smiled. "Pretty important. Messengers. Dr. Walsh says some of these seed varieties could increase yields by 40% while reducing water usage by half. In drought-prone regions, that's the difference between starvation and abundance." Rob nodded, the magnitude of what they'd discovered still sinking in. "Have you spoken with Sullivan or any of the Horizon people?" "They tried," Jack said with a wry smile. "Offered me a prestigious internship with their research division. Full scholarship for the rest of my education too. They really want access to what we found, Dad." "I'm not surprised," Rob said. "According to Commissioner Rawlins, the patents on those kinds of agricultural innovations would be worth billions. But that's exactly what our ancestors were trying to prevent. Knowledge that should benefit everyone being locked away for corporate profit. The night deepened, but the activity around the chamber continued unabated. Rob had signed preliminary agreements with the State Agricultural Department and the university, establishing a framework for the research and distribution of the chamber's contents. The core principle was non-negotiable. Everything found in the chamber would remain in the public domain, freely available to farmers worldwide. By morning, the first scientific papers were already being drafted. The preservation medium used in the chamber, a technology that had somehow kept seeds viable and even in a state of suspended growth for over a century, was generating as much excitement as the seed varieties themselves. Several agricultural research institutions had already pledged funding for further studies, with an emphasis on applications for regions most affected by climate change and food insecurity. As the sun rose over Oakdale Valley, Rob stood at the edge of his field, watching researchers carefully transferring seedlings from the chamber to specialized transport containers. These would be distributed to agricultural stations across the country for propagation and testing, ensuring that no single disaster or intervention could prevent their spread. David Cooper joined him, his weathered face solemn in the early light. "Your great-grandfather would be proud," he said quietly. "Mine too. They all would be." Rob nodded. "I keep thinking about what might have happened if I'd given in to Horizon's offers last month, if I'd sold the farm before discovering the chamber." "You didn't, though," David said firmly. "Just like you didn't take out that extra loan from their subsidiary bank that would have put you underwater. Sometimes stubbornness is its own kind of wisdom." The week that followed was unlike anything Rob had ever experienced. The Jenkins farm became the center of international agricultural attention, with researchers, journalists, and government officials arriving daily. The bank that had been threatening foreclosure suddenly became remarkably accommodating, offering to restructure Rob's loans under terms that recognized the farm's new status as a site of historical and scientific significance. Jack had become an unofficial liaison between the academic researchers and the local farming community, using his agricultural science background to bridge the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application. His professors had granted him special credit for his involvement, recognizing that he was participating in a once-in-a-lifetime educational opportunity. More remarkable than the scientific breakthroughs was the effect on the valley's farmers. Properties that had been on the verge of sale to Horizon were suddenly withdrawn from the market as their owners gained new hope for the future viability of independent farming. A cooperative was quickly formed to coordinate the testing and implementation of the new crop varieties, with Rob elected as its first president, despite his protests that others were better qualified. 10 days after the chamber's discovery, Rob received an unexpected visitor. Harold Mitchell, the elderly son of the valley's record keeper, arrived at the farmhouse in a wheelchair pushed by his caretaker from the Millbrook nursing home. "Had to see it for myself," the old man said, his voice frail but his eyes sharp as he gazed at the hub of activity surrounding the chamber entrance. "Father always said there was something special buried in this valley, something that would change everything when the time was right." Rob helped Harold to a comfortable chair overlooking the field. "Your father was the record keeper, wasn't he? The one who documented everything about the chamber and the seeds?" Harold nodded, a smile creasing his weathered face. "Not just documented. He was one of the engineers. Came out here from Boston in 1895 with nothing but a trunk full of books and scientific instruments. Met your great-grandfather through a correspondence about agricultural innovations. They shared a vision of what farming could be, should be." "Why keep it secret for so long?" Rob asked, the question that had been nagging at him since the discovery. Harold's gaze drifted to the distant horizon. They saw what was coming: the industrialization of agriculture, the patents on seeds and farming methods. They believed that food, the very means of survival, should never be controlled by corporations or governments. But they also knew they were ahead of their time. If they'd released their innovations then, they would have been bought out, co-opted, or worse. So they hid them, Rob said, preserved them for a future when they'd be truly needed, and created a system to ensure they'd only be found at the right time, Harold added. The locks, the symbols, the distributed knowledge among the founding families, it was all designed so that the chamber could only be accessed when modern agriculture reached a critical point. When family farms were on the verge of disappearing entirely. But how could they have predicted that? Rob asked. How could they have known what would happen a century later? Harold's eyes twinkled. They were scientists, Mr. Jenkins. They studied patterns. The consolidation of agricultural power had already begun in their time. They projected where it would lead if left unchecked. He gestured toward the chamber entrance, and they created an intervention, a reset button for agriculture, if you will, that would only activate when most needed. A month after the discovery, the first test plantings of the chamber's seed varieties were showing remarkable results. Crops that normally took weeks to establish were flourishing in days, showing unprecedented resistance to pests and drought conditions. Agricultural scientists around the world were analyzing the genetic properties of these varieties, marveling at solutions to problems that modern biotech firms had spent billions trying to solve. More significant than the seeds themselves were the agricultural methods detailed in the chamber's documents. These outlined holistic approaches to farming that worked with natural systems rather than against them, minimizing the need for chemical inputs while maximizing soil health and productivity. Many of these techniques had been independently rediscovered by modern organic and regenerative agriculture movements, validating the founding families' approaches while adding new dimensions to their implementation. Horizon Agricultural Solutions had not given up entirely. After their direct approaches failed, they attempted to lobby for regulatory interventions, arguing that the chamber's contents required extensive safety testing before widespread distribution. When soil and crop analyses repeatedly confirmed the safety and efficacy of the new varieties, they shifted to legal challenges, claiming that their prior agreements with valley farmers gave them certain rights to agricultural innovations discovered on those properties. These efforts gained little traction in the face of overwhelming public support for keeping the chamber's contents freely available. Agricultural advocacy groups, food security organizations, and even several former Horizon executives who had broken ranks with the corporation organized to defend what was now being called the Oakdale Agricultural Legacy. 6 months after the discovery, Rob stood in his eastern field, the once troublesome acreage where the chamber had been found, watching the first commercial-scale crop grown from the chamber's seeds reaching maturity. The corn stood half again, as tall as conventional varieties, with fuller ears and deeper root systems that required minimal irrigation despite the dry summer. Jack had returned to university to complete his degree, though he came home nearly every weekend to help with the ongoing research. His academic focus had shifted to the study and adaptation of the chamber's agricultural techniques, with his professors encouraging him to develop practical applications for farmers with limited resources. David Cooper ambled up beside Rob, studying the experimental crop with satisfaction. "You know, I never thought I'd live to see something like this," the older farmer said. "Been watching family farms disappear my whole life, watching good people get squeezed out by banks and corporations until there was nothing left but to sell the land their grandparents homesteaded." Rob nodded. understanding exactly what his neighbor meant. And now, David gestured toward the valley, where several farms that had been on the verge of sale to horizon were now implementing the chamber's growing methods. Already their fields showed the vibrant health that came from these techniques. Now there's a future again, not just for us, but for farming itself. Real farming, not those corporate operations where the land is just another resource to exploit until it's exhausted. The Oakdale Valley Agricultural Cooperative had expanded rapidly, now encompassing farms across 3 counties. By pooling resources and sharing equipment, smaller operations were achieving economies of scale that allowed them to compete effectively with corporate agriculture. More importantly, they were implementing the chamber's methods collectively, transforming the landscape in ways that were visible even from satellite imagery. The cooperative's fields stood out as vibrant green patches amid the more conventional farms surrounding them. Rob's farmhouse, once showing signs of deferred maintenance and financial strain, had been carefully restored, not to luxury, but to the solid, purposeful condition it had known in his grandfather's day. The mortgage that had threatened to end 4 generations of Jenkins family farming had been paid off using funds from a foundation established to preserve the historical and scientific significance of the property. The chamber itself had been properly secured and converted into a research facility with climate controls and monitoring systems ensuring the ongoing viability of its remaining contents. A small museum had been established in what had once been the farm's equipment shed, documenting the story of the founding families and their remarkable foresight. School groups and agricultural delegations came weekly to learn about the chamber and its contents, often leaving with sample seeds and growing instructions. 1 year to the day after Rob's plow had struck the chamber's metal door, a ceremony was held on the Jenkins farm. Farmers from across the country gathered to celebrate what many were calling the beginning of a new era in agriculture. The governor spoke about resilience and innovation. Agricultural scientists detailed the ongoing discoveries emerging from study of the chamber's contents. But it was Harold Mitchell, speaking with the authority of someone whose father had helped create the chamber, who captured the true significance of what had happened. A century ago, a group of visionaries saw 2 possible futures for agriculture, the elderly man said, his voice strengthened by purpose despite his frail condition. One where the growing of food became increasingly controlled by corporations and governments, with farmers reduced to contractors managing machinery on land they didn't own. And another where farming remained a calling, a relationship between people and the land they stewarded. He gestured toward the chamber entrance, now housed within a simple but elegant structure designed to protect it while honoring its original purpose. They couldn't prevent the first future from emerging, but they created this time capsule, this gift across generations, to ensure the second future would always remain possible, not through force or legislation, but through knowledge, freely shared, and innovations that couldn't be controlled or patented. As the formal ceremony concluded and people broke into smaller groups, Rob found himself standing with Jack and Commissioner Rawlins at the edge of the field where it had all begun. "We've had inquiries from 27 countries so far," Rawlins said, reviewing notes on her tablet. "Farmers facing everything from drought to soil degradation to corporate seed monopolies. The international distribution network is expanding faster than we can track it." "That's the point, isn't it?" Jack said. "It's not supposed to be trackable or controllable. It's supposed to spread freely, like seeds carried on the wind." Rob nodded, thinking of his great-grandfather's letter. "What we protected here is more than seeds and science. It is hope freely given." He understood now that William Jenkins and the other founding families hadn't just been farmers or even scientists. They had been guardians of a different vision of agriculture, one where knowledge was shared rather than hoarded, where abundance flowed from cooperation rather than competition. The troubled acre that had yielded so poorly for generations had finally produced its intended harvest, not of corn or wheat, but of possibility. The field that Rob had been attempting to plow on that fateful autumn morning had been set apart by his ancestors for a purpose he could never have imagined. It hadn't been poor soil or bad luck that made it different. It had been destiny. As the sun set over Oakdale Valley, painting the fields in golden light, Rob walked along the edge of his eastern acreage. The experimental crops swayed gently in the evening breeze, their extraordinary vigor a testament to knowledge preserved across generations. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, he felt no anxiety about the future of the farm. The Jenkins land would continue, not just as his family's legacy, but as part of something larger, a living laboratory for a different kind of agriculture. The metal door that his plow had struck on that autumn morning hadn't just been an entrance to a hidden chamber. It had been a portal between two eras, allowing the wisdom of the past to flow into a present that desperately needed it. And as Rob watched the researchers and farmers continuing their work, even as darkness fell, he knew that his great-grandfather's vision was being fulfilled in ways even William Jenkins could not have specifically foreseen, but had, somehow, in his wisdom, prepared for. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.